Welcome back to Special Education for Fundies, where I'm going to continue on the same LGP video from part 1. In this part, we'll analyse the alleged humiliation of Richard Dawkins on a radio programme with former Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral in London, Giles Anthony Fraser. This is extracted straight from LGP's video, and I will intervene here and there with commentary. Let us begin, shall we?
Well, I just think this is extraordinary. I mean, to be told by Richard Dawkins what Christianity is or isn't is a very odd thing. I mean, I think we should allow people to self-identify. People are saying that they are Christians, and Richard Dawkins is coming along and saying, no, they're not. Richard, that's
pretty
just not
empty
fair.
though, if they don't believe any of it.
I think that, well, I mean, I think what's happened here is there's a model of belief.
Wait, what? No one told me that Richard Dawkins was running around telling people what they do and don't believe. Where is this criticism coming from? If this is indeed true, then I can't say it isn't an invalid criticism. But let's hear some more, shall we? And see if we hear from Dawkins.
That's being used in this survey, which is actually a very narrow, a very head sort of model. And there are people who are Christians of the heart, practical Christians. There's all sorts of ways of expressing Christianity. And just having a few silly little questions to trip people up just seems to me not a good way of trumping...
Do you think of yourself as religious? And 50% apparently say no.
6% of people who were asked, only 6% of the people said they don't believe in God. The rest of them were not saying that. So it's like people are self-identifying this way. And Richard, it's not fair for you to come along and just have a questionnaire which trumps people's self-identification.
It's also, Richard Dawkins, mechanistic, isn't it? It's just the wrong way to look at these matters. It doesn't actually tell us anything interesting.
It tells us an awful lot.
Oh, I see what's happening here. This is a misunderstanding. This is all about that How Religious Are UK Christian survey from last year, conducted by the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. It does indeed tell us an awful lot, but it doesn't seem to be telling anyone what they believe. In fact, it's asking them what they believe, and the results are self-explanatory. Let's go through it, shall we? First of all, the rationale for the survey. The number of people who select Christian on census forms is usually rather high, and indicates how many people self-identify, label themselves, or think of themselves as Christians. This number is usually used to justify the religious influence over public policy, and this research was conducted to determine how many of those self-identifying Christians actually agree with this justification. It was not done to tell people how Christian they were, but to show everyone how appearances can be deceiving, particularly on census results. In this case, the appearance of a high percentage of Christians does not necessarily reflect the high percentage of people who wish to enforce Christian teachings into public policy, usually because they simply don't follow or believe any themselves. The survey itself was a set of 55 questions, beginning with 2 screening questions to determine relevance to the 2011 census results. As you can see, 54% self-identified as Christian for this survey. These are the people this survey was most interested in, primarily because that figure alone represents a majority of the population, and that is the same majority used to justify religious-based policy not just in the UK, but in any country where the majority of the population is of a certain religious preference. It's worth noting here, as a quick digression, the high percentage of non-religious people recorded for the UK as well. But let's move on. As Dawkins said, the survey does indeed tell us a lot. The first major point made by the Foundation is that only about a third of self-identifying Christians cited religious belief as the reason they had ticked the Christian box in the 2011 census. This is actually a little generous if you ask me, because according to the survey results, specifically those of question 3 recorded a figure of 28%. The difference from 28% to a third is much larger than the distance to a quarter in this case, which makes those who self-identify as religious due to belief a much smaller minority than the 54% of people who identify as Christian at all. By the way, this figure is the result of the answers of people who took the question, meaning it is those people who are telling us what they do and do not believe, not Dawkins telling them. Dawkins just asked them a question and they answered. These are their answers. The second major finding of the survey is the results of answers to question 10. That is, how often, if at all, do you pray independently and from choice? I mean when not in a church service or other religious meeting. According to the results, we get 37% of self-identifying Christians who do not pray. In all fairness though, 35% pray once a week or more, but this could merely reflect a third of people who claim to be Christian due to belief in their religion. I would assume that the excess of 7% of once a weekers are people who find some personal solace in the act of prayer rather than any belief that what they pray for will actually happen. Nevertheless, 37% of people who identify as Christian told the surveyor that they never or almost never pray. This is not a result so easily ignored, as it suggests how less than seriously people consider their religion these days. The third major point made by this survey, and the last one I'll cover for time limitations, although there are many more to go through, and of course I'll link the survey results in full below. But the third major point is that only 10% of self-identifying Christians consider religious teachings and belief to be a source of moral guidance. Only 10%! Now, I know what you're thinking. Why do we hear so frequently that objective moral standards can only come from God if only 10% of Christians actually believe it? Well, that's easy. It's because they're a very loud 10%. But they are, according to these results, a very small minority with a Dunning-Kruger problem. And I would not be surprised if these results were very similar in countries like Australia. I'm not sure about the United States though. In short, nobody is telling anybody what they believe, but they are being asked what they believe and what they practice in a religion that is purported to be so popular that it should be the way by which everyone must live. But let's hear it now from Dawkins himself, shall we? Back to the interview.
When you say, I'm telling people what it is to be Christian, we ask them a very comprehensive list of questions. You can look at the press release. It would be very hard for anyone to deny that many of these questions, most of these questions, are fundamental to the Christian religion.
But you're saying they're not Christians even if they think of themselves as Christian. You know what they are, even though they tell you
I'm not presenting my opinion here. This press release is offered to people to look down it and say, look, these people who call themselves Christians actually don't read the Bible, don't go to church, don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, don't even know what the first book of the New Testament is.
Although I tried, I don't think I could have said it better myself. So I'm hard-pressed figuring out what is so humiliating for Dawkins here. In fact, that could well be one of the least arrogant and best articulated rebuttals I've heard him make, ever. But there is more to this interview, and in all fairness, he does get tripped up a little bit, but it really is such a trivial matter that, well, let's just hear it, shall we?
Up to you to make up your mind whether you think they're Christian. Don't ask me. My opinion is not relevant.
Richard, if I said to you, what is the full title of The Origin of Species? I'm sure you could tell me that.
Yes, I could.
Go on then.
On the origin of species, on the origin of species, there is a subtitle with respect to the preservation of favoured races in the fight in the struggle for
You're
life.
the high pope of Darwinism.
Not bad,
and
give him some justice.
But if you asked people who believed in evolution what that question, and you came back and said 2% got it right, it would terribly easy for me to go, they don't really believe it after all. It's just not fair to ask people these questions. They self-identify as Christians, and I think you should respect that.
On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, is a really long title, and really old science that has since been synthesised into much more modern science, making it quite redundant to the discoveries being made today. Sure, it's a classic, it's pioneering, something to be treasured and carefully looked after, but today's leaders in the field of evolutionary biology have less need to remember the title of this book than they do the titles of much more recent publications, such as the Lenski paper, Historical Contingency and the Evolution of a Key Innovation in an Experimental Population of Escherichia coli. I have no idea if I pronounced that correctly, because I'm not a biologist. But it's also a much longer title to remember than Bible. Just saying. But I'm going to give LGP this one. Just one. Because that would be a little humiliating. But far from the reasons LGP thinks, and the questions put forward by Fraser were hardly well thought out, most certainly irrelevant, and based on a complete misunderstanding of the intention and results of the survey. Unfortunately, I have been unable to find the radio interview in full, though not for lack of trying. If anyone would happen to know where I could find it, I would be grateful for a copy, so inbox me if you know. And finally, this video would not be complete without me making the point to thank Wildwood Claire 1 for the shout out last weekend, and the small influx of subscribers that I've had as a result. While my videos are far from an attempt to seek attention, if it's at all possible that the extended reach of my videos is able to mitigate some of the damage that may be caused by creationist disaster videos on YouTube, then I welcome the attention with open arms and much appreciation to Claire. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
This is something I could never understand because I'm never sure, and I've never had a plan. But I'm certain as the moon gets tossed around that we don't make a sound till there's time to slow